So my talk is titled "An Office of Reports, Overwork and Overwriting in the South Korean or in the Korean business life." This talk is based on my doctoral research that I conducted at Michigan and developed during my postdocs at Harvard and Brandeis. So just an overview of my research: I spent 1 year working within a South Korean conglomerate that I call Sangdo, and I spent a number of months and months afterwards in 2016, 2017, interviewing office workers at different companies and tracking commentary about office life in the news and popular media in South Korea. So my broad interest, let me see if I can click here, seen from Misang, my broad interest has been in forms and genres of language and communication within South Korean workplaces. So this interest stemmed from recent scholarship in different fields, mostly outside of Korean studies, into thinking about the relationship between corporate and organizational forms and the huge amount of written genres like meetings and workshops, databases and Excel sheets, and meetings and workshops and new technologies of communication that have proliferated in the last century. And on one hand, anyone who's been to a South Korean office knows that they're extremely complex environments from the point of view of communication, incorporating aspects of government bureaucracy and documentation and Western management trends. And these forms of communication are often left out of the story of Korean management and work life, as we tend to focus issues around, when we talk about workplaces or corporations in chaebol, we tend to think about them from a top-down perspective or from statistics that can be well enumerated, such as labor hours or job satisfaction. But forms of communication and writing and working on computers are hard to account for and so they often don't show up in our accounts of Korean labor and corporate life. So, but yet for millions of office workers in South Korea and those who depend on them, much of the actual work they do can be considered as a type of what I call genre work. And these problems around genres and the proliferation of genres in Korea are not historical relics of the 20th century. Employees work on databases and Excel sheets, develop PowerPoint reports, update websites, send internal communication, develop copy for e-magazines, and translate between languages, and so on. And this kind of work is not often enumerated in national statistics or captured in labor figures, but it's certainly one of the reasons why South Korean workers spend considerable time at the office and how they think about the negative aspects of their work. So what I want to focus on today are some broad themes from some published work I've done on the topic. I want to make the argument that when we approach genre work and its relationship to the problem of overwork in Korea, that it's not so easily explained by recourse to, say, historical legacy, Korea's, intense work culture, something like cultural lag, capitalist exploitation, or harsh work norms, though those certainly all play a role. But I want to suggest today that a focus on overwork and overwriting reflects a particular conjuncture in the South Korean work landscape that reflects broader global issues in white-collar work. On one side, global developments in human resource management have led to thinking about human performance in terms of financial performance through the advent of things like key performance indicators, annual metrics, performance bonuses, and annual grades. At the same time, the nature of white-collar work has become particularly marked by non-quantitative, non-measurable forms of communication, like reports, plans, contracts, intranets, databases, and email, as most of our people in the university world know, that are often collectively authored and hard to individualize. So in South Korea, this problem is made more complicated by being embedded within complex managerial hierarchies that we're probably all familiar with, in which managers act as both an audience for documents as well as an evaluator of individual performance. So part of what I want to suggest today then is that aspects of people's work around different kinds of genres like reports are not just tied to corporate stuff like competitiveness or innovation or efficiency. These aren't corporate topics in some sense. Genre work is also tied to personal things like how individuals think about their performance, their advancement, or their survival in a competitive white-collar labor market. And this particular coupling of organizational documentation and individual performance has created some complex dynamics around the very production of documents and can begin to explain why office workers might spend so much time at the office, even in a highly digital economy. So let me start by talking about someone who's wanted to get rid of documents and PowerPoints altogether. So in 2016, the credit card giant Hyundai Card declared war on PowerPoint. This was done through an internal campaign called Zero PPT. The campaign was aimed at eliminating the use of PowerPoint for the company's 3,000 person workforce, and was later extended to its sister companies, Hyundai Life, Hyundai Capital, and Hyundai Commercial. This reflected, the campaign slogan was written as "Let's not work for the sake of making reports," which I think you can see in small characters below there. This reflected an idea that at the time that PowerPoint was excessive, and that the company culture had simply transformed into, quote, a culture of reports, or as Nojin said, bogoseo munhwa. And Hyundai Card employees were encouraged to make reports and other programs like Excel, limit them to 1 or 2 pages, and make them, quote, argument-centered. Company computers were even reprogrammed to prevent PowerPoint slides from being created at all. Existing PowerPoints were set to read only. Now, according to the CEO, Chung Tae-young of Hyundai Card, his public announcement on Facebook, the Zero PPT program saved 50 million pieces of paper and untold hours of meetings over its first year. This frames it almost as a matter of climate change, echoing ideas from the early 2000s about the importance of paperless office. But the allusion to a culture of reports makes clear that the emphasis is not on the technological medium per se, but how report writing through PowerPoint was contributing to unnecessary documentation, particularly in ways that punish the report writers. We can see echoes here in criticisms of other modern practices that are run amok or taken to extreme in Korea, such as excessive gift giving or consumer purchasing, that have been described in work by the anthropologists Laura Kendall and Laura Nelson. It also reflects a certain ethic of managerial efficiency that thinks that management, or that envisions management as a way to create productive efficiency to drive national competitiveness. The historian of Japan, Andrew Gordon, has described this latter narrative as being particularly strong in Japan, one in which the idea about productivity as being one of the most prominent narratives of Japan's post-war economic growth. And I think it's fair to say that this story also echoes certain celebratory stories of technology in South Korea's history of development. Now, Hyundai Card's approach rests on an assumption that office life can be fine-tuned through just the right kind of documentation, not the total removal of documentation altogether. That is, it is an alignment between company operations and its media. So for Hyundai, this meant reporting in other media, like encouraging employees to report in Excel, one page, or sometimes even over the phone, going back to an older form of media, if we think about it. And we can think of these as what scholar Lana Gershon has called a media ideology. And a media ideology looks at how people understand the communicative potential and material limitations of a given channel of communication. So for many critics in the West, for instance, there's a media ideology around PowerPoint. PowerPoint exists as a certain kind of medium that is both at times dumb and evil. At times, ideas popularized by the scholar Edward Tufte, who literally wrote that PowerPoint was evil. And such ideologies are not false. We're not saying that they're false, but because we certainly all have had bad experiences with PowerPoint, but they are rooted in a certain kind of idea about what a medium should convey. So for Westerners, PowerPoint represents the antithesis of rhetorical argument, or a visual prop that has replaced clarity, replaces the clarity that comes through oratory. And is worth comparing this to the idea of zero PowerPoint at Hyundai, which might be reflective of Korean media ideology. The emphasis not on a low register of communication or simplistic representations of complex ideas, but on curtailing a culture in which simple forms of exchange have gotten out of hand, not unlike excessive wedding gifts or perhaps shots of soju. These are better fixed by simplifying the channel to prevent this kind of personalistic excess in which managers might excessively order reports and workers excessively tweak them to their manager's liking, all basically wasting company time. But this kind of explanation doesn't explain why workers and managers alike might put so much emphasis on things like PowerPoint even when they might have very little value for the company. So with that, I want to explain some context around why workers and managers think and spend so much time on things like PowerPoints and reports. So it's necessary to think about the context of labor and Korean promotions in white-collar office spaces. While we generally think of white-collar workers as having privileged positions relative to the rest of working society, especially those in the famous Cheongyujik positions, or the regular work or almost tenure-like positions, especially at large international companies, competition within such companies is very fierce, and tenure is not guaranteed. Until the late 90s, in Korea, under a seniority-based system known as hobongjae, automatic promotions up the corporate ladder came at regular intervals at fixed-year gaps. But since the early 2000s, in what is known as the Songkwa-juri shide, or the the performanceism era, annual performance evaluations have had a stronger role in determining one's status. And while the dream of lifetime employment in Korea is largely gone, even making it 10 years in a company now is a relatively difficult feat. On average, at large corporations, with statistics from 2015, for example, for every 100 new college graduates hired, 67 would make it past the first 4 years, 25 past the next 8 years, and only 5 would stay after 12 years. And only 2 out of the original 100 on average, would make it to the level of general manager or bujang, which might come after roughly 16 years of work. So annual evaluations are one of the means through which workers are progressively evaluated for these coveted positions higher up. And if it's December or January in South Korea, this is known as insacheol, or personnel season, when office workers are graded through grades like S, A, B, C, or D. And when large companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, as well as public corporations and government agencies, announce their executive promotions, transfers, and dismissals. So favorable grades or promotions or transfers can become like the invisible witchcraft of corporate Korea. Workers become anxious about the kinds of readings their actions take and how or may not connect to the whims of a superior. For example, blogs I surveyed at the time described a feeling of being restless, or shinsun sengsun, being full of twists and turns while awaiting someone's promotion or evaluation. And it required great mental anguish in wondering how one's own actions were linked to the impressions of superiors. The cartoon here depicts the conflicted feelings of a worker who depends on his boss's good graces while also secretly hoping that he gets transferred to another team. And because managers performing an image of a good subordinate to one's boss is equally as important as performing abstract or labor in the abstract sense. That is, one is trying to impress your boss to get a good evaluation as much as one is trying to do good work or hit good numbers. Because of the importance of managers as evaluators, evaluations seem to pervade beyond specific moments of evaluation. Everyday activities can thus count in new ways during personnel season, not in the objective numbers of sales figures or reports, but in the minds of superiors who witness work or signs of effort. Work advice books suggest ways of making work visible in conventional ways. You might stay at work late to be seen doing extra work. You might choose to attend end-of-year parties. You might do subtler tricks as well, such as making easy work seem harder than it is, or getting in extra face time by going into a boss's office to deliver a document by hand when email might suffice. So this personnel dynamic explains in part why manager-employee relations are often sites of conflict, because they're not just doing work, but the manager is always an evaluator in some sense of the worker as a person and as a potential future a member of the company in higher ranks. And managers and employees frequently interact over the production of documents. So I want to show a cartoon from the newspaper Hangyeong in which two employees, or manager and employee, are divided over what constitutes a proper report. The cartoon caption tells the story of the assistant manager on the right, who was scolded for his style of writing. He encountered problems because, quote, he didn't follow the company's set of rules. He was supposed to have font, batang, font size 13, line spacing 160%, color grayscale, and so on. He thought that if he made the report so that one could understand the contents, that would be okay. But he got culture shock at these so-called regulations. Now, the assistant manager associated a report with its content in mind, but he did not heed the company's regulations for document drafting. And the cartoon implies that the rules are arbitrary at the end of the day and rather outdated, associated with older forms of formal drafting, not modern PowerPoint, and merely a matter of personal discretion of the older manager to enforce them. In this sense, the assistant manager must now learn how to adapt to this company's style, but he must also learn that this is the style that his boss prefers. Later in the description in the article in Hangyeong, the assistant manager was reported to coerce other coworkers to check over his PowerPoint reports prior to delivering them to this fickle manager. Now, the cartoon paints a picture of two office types, recognizable to many of us, but by subtle identity cues. So the clash between an emotionally volatile, company-loyal older manager and the young, globally oriented, ideas-based younger guy instantiates a productive generational trope in the Korean office: old versus new, rules versus creativity, senior versus junior. This clash is precipitated and mediated by decisions around competing tastes, those that adhere to the rules on one side and those that have merit through their own content. This implication is that such a generational miscalibration between juniors and seniors is blocking the success of Korean companies and a key source of office headaches. Now, companies have their own rules that specify pro forma rules about document forwarding, such as font sizes, line spacing, and margins. But such rules hardly cover the aesthetic and genre variations potent in any possible PowerPoint document. Moreover, the qualities of such documents, their timing, their material form, whether they're printed out, how they're presented, is rarely elevated to the level of official commentary, but are highly salient to employees and managers. Employees regularly attune to this information as they are socialized in the office. Perhaps most importantly, employees attune to the personalities and tastes of their managers to create and deliver reports or other documents. One mid-level manager I spoke to, who I interviewed, who worked at a public company, or Kongyo, described how he has to, quote, catch a style. At the public company, his bosses rotated frequently, and as such, he had to learn what a boss's style was like. In our case, you have to, quote, catch the style of your direct boss quickly and then match your style when you write something. It's just more convenient. Like if someone starts to work in your department and you need to get a decision within 1 month, I need to catch how he looks at reports or what style he likes, and then I match it. That's how you do it. When I asked him whether they had standard files that they could just use, if that would be easier, he said, yes, there are standard files on the company intranet, but there are some subtle differences about what bosses want. Some people like graphs. As for colors, some people like reports to be more colorful. Some people like pictures or models. If I match it, it's much easier for me too. If I don't match it, then they always make you redo it. So at a practical level, grasping the taste of a boss is not just about showing off one's own skill, but about getting a decision or approval on a document. So it often can be passed along to a higher authority for further approval or review. In this sense, arranging information into a complex text with clear arguments, evidence, visual layout, and readability is a task of anticipation. In a system with nested ranks like a Korean company, these acts of refinement continue up the managerial hierarchy. A high-ranking executive I worked with at Songdo, where I conducted field research, told me that he himself had developed his own style of presenting documents to the chairman, the highest person in the hierarchy. He made sure to present 3 clearly distinct options on a slide from which the chairman could choose. He anticipated a desired role for the chairman, allowing him to make an informed but simple decision without presenting too much or too little information, sort of the Goldilocks theory of writing a report. The idea that one should attune writing to other people is frequently found in work advice books as well. Books like The White Rate of Report, Seven Principles of Reporting, and God of Reports, bogoseo, often over-dramatize the stakes of report writing for young employees. The cover of the Seven Principles of Reporting, for instance, declares that, quote, the moment of reporting can decide your fate. Now, nevertheless, the books advocate that success in submitting documents comes from developing an attunement to the needs of superiors, not just good writing. In a book titled Secret Weapons That Work at Work, suggests that employees should attune to the moments around reporting, particularly to the needs of one's boss. Things like, it advises the key points are: find out and report on what information the other person or the boss needs, make reports primarily based on what the boss is interested in, to become a talented person who's good at work, the art of listening is crucial, and reports should be just like a loop, always creating a connection to the next thing. And lastly, in the book, God of Reporting, this process is likened to one of mind reading. The diagram here depicts not just the exchange of communication, but the exchange of thoughts between two people. It recommends that writers, or the person writing the document, should grasp or POC the problem of the person giving, while making sure that the request that is given and the document act as one, or ilchi. The generalized roles of a writing person and a reading person reflect how this dyadic relationship can be imagined across different ranks, authorities, and genres. So depicting these two people as floating heads allows us to think about this at all levels and all ranks of a Korean office. So a mid-level manager I spoke to, who often worked with a chairman of her conglomerate, described this practice in similar terms, but a different word. She described it as finding the bonshim, or true feelings of her bosses. Bonshim, in fact, goes further in thinking about this act of mind reading, because it's not about anticipating even actual thoughts. It's about knowing what a person can truly feel inside, even if perhaps they do not know it. So to the degree that Korean office workers attune so well to norms of other orientation and their interactional and material translations, why would anyone ever overwork? Seems like people attune very well to what other people are thinking. But we might think about the view from the other side. So to be a superior who does not evaluate, edit, or correct at all, is to be a superior with no authority. So in the cartoon I described earlier from Hangyeong, which I showed here again, the recourse to company regulations here represented the last bastion of authority for an older manager seemingly outsmarted by a younger generation. Opportunities for obstruction can take place over different moments. In Korea, there's a stereotype of a red pen manager who marks up documents excessively, akin to school teachers correcting their students. And there are other epithets as well. There are managers who are known for being fastidious, 꼼꼼하다, when they recheck figures and numbers and second guess their own employees. And there are managers who hold marathon meetings, or marathonwei, to review documents at length. The performative necessity of such authoritative intervention is not insignificant. To be a manager who approves everything and reviews nothing reveals that one has no authority at all. So for managers or executives in large organizations, to be at the receiving end of documents is usually, to be at the top of a hierarchy, we usually assume to be a sign of institutional authority. But it also means that one is at the receiving end of a long document chain. So it means being at the whims of those below and being constrained in the types of actions that one can take. So taking examples from the Sangdo Corporation, where I conducted fieldwork, I want to describe how a team of high-level managers at Sangdo found their authority constrained in a process that they were, in fact, in charge of. So I spent a week working with the performance management team of Sangdo, and I unfortunately can't show too many pictures because of a lot of confidential documents and personal confidentiality, but I'll show sort of a schematic here. So the performance management team at Sangdo oversaw productivity and sales across all of the group's subsidiaries. Their oversight, however, was mediated by a single report, the monthly management report, or 월간 경영 보고서. And each Sangdo subsidiary was responsible for submitting this up to the chairman and other owners. So when I shadowed the team, which included 3 assistant members, a team manager, and a new executive, they were revamping this monthly reporting process. An issue for the team was how to create a PowerPoint template that subsidiaries could produce within a narrow time frame and limited space that could accurately summarize their key events each month, such as how many new sales they had, how many new clients they had, that kind of thing. To be legible for the chairman, however, each report was meant to be 3 to 5 PowerPoint slides only. The performance management team would also have to submit the document quickly at the end of each month, lest the reports and information become, quote, 쓰레기, or trash, in the words of one team member. So I participated in a pair of lengthy meetings organized by the team executive to discuss the new template. In the meetings, these high-level managers attempted to align the chairman's anticipated needs, or needs, frequent word in Korean office life, with the format of the template itself. But because they did not know exactly what the chairman would need, they debated how to translate different pieces of information into the textual specifics of a PowerPoint. One of their discussions centered on, for example, the ratio of quantitative and qualitative information. They literally argued whether they should have 60-40, 80-20, or 40-60 qualitative or quantitative information. Quantitative information like sales information was useful and easy to assemble, but it would not provide any interpretation of what the data meant. Qualitative information like analyses of market trends or explanatory remarks about increases or decreases in sales would be more beneficial to interpreting the data. It would also demonstrate the team's own expertise better. Qualitative heavy reports, however, came with a risk. It would require subjective interpretation, more information gathering, and a longer production time to analyze data and make consistently useful insights. One manager voiced concern about the commitments they might be unwittingly signing up for. What if they merely gave the same insights every month? So they were not just concerned about the relation between information and its summary to the chairman, that is, what the chairman might need to make an informed decision. They were also concerned with how their own labor and expertise would be read through the document as well. Now, the new executive believed that taking longer to deliver good information would make the reports useless, as it would be too late to make decisions. Asking subsidiaries to submit the information in a shorter period, such as at a fixed date each month, might risk employees having to work on weekends or holidays to meet deadlines. This fact seemed particularly obvious to the younger managers on the performance management team, who deemed it unfair to make others work over holidays. The executive had less sympathy. He considered excuses for being late, including national holidays, very suspicious. And he harbored some skepticism towards the subsidiaries and their motivations, calling them at one point rotten excuse makers, 비린 냄새 나는 벤지리. It's certainly not a good way to describe anyone. And he suggested they were trying to hide their poor results from the chairman by delaying the reports themselves. Presumably, if the chairman got them too late, he wouldn't be able to take action. Now, in one of their meetings, the executive emphasized to the team the importance of the physical act of delivering the report to the chairman. If the executive were to deliver the numbers with no analysis but on time, it would be completely valueless for the team. They would be merely conduits in a larger chain. So as figurative extensions of the chairman, however, the team should come up with some analysis to include in the report to demonstrate their own expertise and validate their own positions in the company. As they debated what kind of qualitative information to include, one joked that including too much information would start to resemble a school textbook. So this example of the performance management team, and I apologize for not having a lot of visuals around it, it encapsulates elements of the organizational logjam I've been trying to describe. So people in this team who were trained accountants and business analysts and were at the very top of the conglomerate, their jobs essentially were premised on collating and submitting reports to the chairman. This logjam was worked out inside the documents in terms of what to include, as well as outside of the documents in terms of what deadlines to set, what the turnaround time was, and how to deliver it. That disagreement arose within the team is not surprising. The executive who reported directly to the chairman was adamant that the performance management team should be an expert player in the company, lest they be seen as superfluous. But for the junior managers, they faced a risk of their own. The burden of producing insights was ultimately up to them. They had to make the reports. They would be responsible for tracking down people that were late or did it incorrectly, also tracking market trends and interpreting quantitative data. This would mean they would work on the weekends most likely too. But the potential for failure on their part might bring into doubt their own suitability within the performance management team. So we might be thinking, well, why didn't the team just ask the chairman what he wanted or ask the subsidiaries what was reasonable? It was the job of the performance management team, however, to attune to this condition, or to attune to this as a condition of their expertise, which was purportedly the highest in the whole conglomerate. It was also a condition of their expertise to institute discipline and order into the subsidiaries whose performance results were viewed skeptically by those above. Monthly management reporting was not just a way of gathering information, but the process itself was a form of discipline whose levers could be adjusted to increase control at the headquarters. Yet in Sangdo's case, it was the elite team, the performance management team, that became consumed by the creation of such a template and its production, engaging in marathon meetings themselves over a number of days, while discussing the details of a PowerPoint template and debating what kinds of documentary commitments they would be crafting for themselves. So now I want to turn to wrapping up. I want to return back to the idea of efficiency and ideals. The idea of making everything one page has been quite popular in Korea, as seen by these different books that have come out in the past few years. Yet these, while people like the Hyundai Card have popularized them, within companies they also have their own pitfalls. So when I interviewed a senior advisor named Manager Jung, who was a retired but sort of an advisor figure in the Sangdo group, I had wanted to ask him about the history of the group, but he quickly diverted into his own pet theory about documentation reform, which he was currently obsessed with. He saw Sangdo as deeply flawed, as Korea as well, with one of the reasons stemming from myriad forms of documentation, relating in part to Koreans' unwillingness, in his view, to share and work for the collective good. In his view, Sangdo managers focused too much attention on PowerPoint documents, leading to wasted time and distorted views of information as they moved up the managerial chain. He advocated that the entire management chain be simplified by only using a one-page document listing efficiency metrics straight from the factory floors, suggesting a close collaboration between objective information and the medium of documentation, not unlike what Hyundai Card did. These one-pagers, he thought, would go directly from the factory floor to the chairman, skirting the middle managers in between. And this document would not be edited at all. It would just be a plain depiction of productive efficiency imagined through numbers, the complete opposite of the highly stylized PowerPoint. And despite the fervor of his ideas, however, his own office had been relegated from the 39th floor to the 3rd floor of the Sangdo Tower where he worked. And this was to make way for a new executive. So for Manager Jung to claim that the group should minimize its modes of documentation and reliance on PowerPoint was a position that shut him out of the internal economy that he was criticizing. So I want to end on a slightly different note by thinking about the work of Nancy Abelman, who I've been teaching to my students in Understanding Korea 1 here at Sheffield, and whose work on gender mobility and melodrama are very important in the field of the anthropology of Korea, but may seem topically somewhat far from what I've talked about today around documents and reports and overwork in Korea. In many ways, Abelman's descriptions of narratives mobility were an important way for us to move away from thinking about how development only happened at macro levels, or economic development only happened at macro levels and numerical figures, to moving to how individual people understand and narrate the changes in Korean society over the last half of the 20th century. Now, documents in corporate life are not may seem far from these concerns about how people narrate their own class mobility. But in many ways, I want to have us think about the fact that documents are not just the domain of corporations or chaebol or management. Rather, they are deeply embedded in how people imagine their own roles in such corporations and how they interact with others and anticipate and fret over their own mobility uh, within these highly competitive institutions. And I've hoped to show that documents and reports, as what we might think of as micro dramas of mobility happening on the office floor, offer us new perspectives on office life in South Korea today. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for the interesting talk. So now we will open up for question and answer session. So if you have a question about anything about the research and your comments, please use the chat that function. If you want to speak with your question, you may just note in the Q&A space, then Evan might be able to turn your mic on. So if you have a question, please enter into the Q&A space. Then as they come in, Evan will read the questions and Mike, so the Mike could answer the questions. So we are waiting that the very first question so that Mike could answer. Mike, can you talk more about, while we are waiting for the questions to come in, your research methodologies, right? So you are obviously there as a foreigner, right? So whether they knew it's anthropology, participant observation, and whether they knew that why you were there or not, and whether your presence may have affected what you're observing. I'm curious about your kind of methodologies and your experiences there.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you surveyed 100 anthropologists and asked them, are you worried about the observer's paradox? They would probably all say no, based because the method of long-term ethnographic fieldwork is meant to overcome some of the barriers that we often have with the research interface. Like I give you an interview, you answer some questions. So certainly my relationship changed the first 2 weeks I was there versus the last 2 weeks I was there over the course of a year. And in terms of what I had wanted to do methodologically, I had much more systematic plans to catalog lots of these different genres. At some point, I had an Excel sheet talking about all these different kinds of reports and plans and things like that. And the problem with doing corporate work or corporate research in Korea or elsewhere is that there are a lot more barriers to this kind of research than there are in other places. And so you're somewhat at the whim of what you're shown, what people are willing to talk about. My own strategy at the initial part was to essentially be a worker, and I was hired as an employee, which you might remember at some point. And that was good in the sense of I was able to get into certain kinds of spaces, get to know people very well, not just get standard corporate answers, see how they made documents, that kind of thing. At the same time, it made it much more difficult. You also, the things you want to do as a researcher in a researcher hat are much more difficult. So they called me an intern. I was also sort of a keakjik or a contract worker, and I would want to say, oh, can you show me, systematically, some of your emails and your reports and that kind of thing. And they say, well, you're just an intern. So it was a sort of a double-edged research experience of being very close to people and then also not having a lot of access to the things that you wanted to study. So yeah, we could talk more, but yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. Were there people who you were able to discuss your research with and provide some more share information that otherwise wouldn't share?
Oh yeah, I mean, we talked a lot. I mean, and in some ways, being an intern and new to the company was in some sense dovetailed with the research, and because you're just asking questions a lot. How do you do this? How do you do that? They all knew from day one that I was a researcher. So yeah, I don't want to give the impression that I was, what's the word, Weejang or something, going in there secretly, and I would stick out anyway. But they knew I just sort of minimized the degree to which I was sort of asking pointed questions like, when you're in an open office environment and you can't just go around saying, well, tell me about how much you don't like your boss or something like that. So it required a lot of delicacy, and if I could have gone back, I might have done it differently. But at the time, it was very tricky to do, and as people in Korean studies know, it's been very hard for us to get uh, you know ethnographies or insider kind of accounts from corporations.
Okay, great. We have several questions now, Kevin. Great.
Great.
Evan, can you read the question from anonymous attendee? We'll get to the
Hi.
first question a little bit later. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a question from an undergraduate freshman, and the question is, you spoke mainly about the relationship between employees and managers. If possible, could you talk about what relationships between coworkers look like? And did this competitive environment and managers have an impact on coworker relationships?
That is a great question, and a really good one. And the question is then, how do we think about what a coworker is? Because usually on any Korean team, usually people will be stratified by rank, or if not rank, Tawanderi, Kwajang. If not that, if they're same, they often will distinguish by when they join. So there's a sort of implicit hierarchy in a lot of in most teams that I've seen, and with people rarely sort of being at the same rank, which doesn't mean that they're all competitive or all sort of evaluating each other, but it does engender different kinds of relationships. So there's a term that a lot of Korean workers use, which is sasu and bisasu, which I believe means sniper and assistant sniper, which I think is a military borrowing. But when a worker joins, they'll often be assigned or paired with another person who will sort of show them the ropes, how to write things, how to sort of learn about life. But there's it used to be in managing in some imagined time in the 90s, people have told me that documents had to go through every person on a team. So you would have to go through every 5 people on a team, and then at some point they decided that was just too crazy, and now they've in this kind of team culture that has been cultivated in Korea, the 5 people, maybe if they're stratified, they'll still all just report to this person called the team manager. So in theory, there's sort of a flat structure there. But yeah, that's a great question. I could talk for more about it. In general, people are helpful because these are collective activities, collective productions. It does get tricky, obviously, when you get to personnel season, and oftentimes in Korean companies, managers are forced to give out not grades as generously as professors do, but often they're forced. It's not even a curve. They just have to give out 1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D, or something like that, and that also creates a lot of tensions that I heard about. I didn't see them as much. Obviously, it's a sensitive thing, but certainly knew that's an issue. So yeah, to answer the question, there's a lot of cooperative, helping each other out, staying late to help someone's presentation, and then there can be moments of competition based on this kind of personnel system.
Okay, great. Evan, I'm gonna read a question from Jiwon Lee, and we have a question also from, no surprise here, your former teachers, Youngju Ryu and Junan. Why don't Youngju and Jun ask question in their own voice? But I'm gonna read the next question. So this is from Jiwon Lee. She's at SUNY Albany. So welcome to Michigan. She's a PhD student at the SUNY Albany. So she has a question about more comparative sense. Is there any other countries controlling the workers in this way that you know of? If this is a sort of a unique culture, why do Korean companies do so? Instead of controlling them through the other possible mechanisms such as wage or else?
Well, let me clarify. There are aspects of the wage system, the benefit system, aspects of internal management that are obviously relevant in Korea, and that are ways that people think about it. My focus was really just on the mediation of work and how people often understand advancement in terms of the work that they have to put in, the amount of time that they have to put in, and how that mediates the relationship to with their boss, and also sort of their larger position, say, getting promoted in a company. In this sense, I don't think that issue, because those kind of white collar issues are fairly common. I don't think this is a unique issue to Korea, and I think it would be interesting to look at it in lots of other places. I don't know if other people have taken that particular angle, but for me, it's certainly one that has a lot of cultural discourses in Korea among the middle class office worker community, or not community, but the middle class office worker. Um, uh, Millions of people who are thinking about these issues, but to the degree perhaps they're not as well articulated, but or have such certain kinds of, or don't articulate with certain kind of other cultural aspects, like traditionalism and modernism and development. I'd still think you'd find very similar issues in American companies, where the HR trends are similar around individual performance, and also the communicative environments is similar around things like email and Slack, and shared wikis and that kind of stuff, things that where you have the same tension between kind of a pseudo financial system of evaluating people, and then a sort of almost communitarian view of how people should work together, that just don't clash. So I think there would be definitely interesting comparative aspects in lots of other places.
Great. Do we have a Youngju online? Okay.
I'm here.
Great. Go ahead.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Youngju.
So excited to hear that you had 60 Korean studies majors at Sheffield. That I think that's amazing. And I look forward to congratulating you for and celebrating with you the great success of Korean studies program at Sheffield. So the question that I have has to do with digitalization. And I think you touched on it briefly. You touched on it briefly during your talk, but I wondered if you could make it more explicit. Did I lose you for a bit?
I might have lost you, but you're here now.
Yeah. So I think we're all finding out with our own Zoom fatigue that digitalization and these advances our ability to do so much more, just in terms of absolute ability, is actually creating more work and increasing the amount of labor on the part of the employees. I often see in Korean media sort of celebration of how ahead of the curve Korean businesses are in terms of 5G, in terms of all of the good things that come with technology, and implicitly where they sneer at the Japanese corporate world, which is still stuck, and they're still faxing, using fax machines to send their reports, etc. And I'm just wondering, within that context, do you find this in relation to report writing, the impact of just digitalization in workload, and how people are talking about that or managing that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I try to think about for a long time. Right? Is there some sort of digital divide? I think thinking about Korean workplaces and Korean society is so digitally connected, and there's certainly a lot of interesting aspects about how things are digitally mediated in the office. I mean, Koreans have had electronic signatures. Basically, we're getting approvals, doing that electronically, and doing it over the phone. They've had that for 20 years now. Little things like that. Obviously, intranets there's the whole dissertation waiting to be written on Korean intranets. And there's, I think, aspects of that dovetail into the idea of efficiency. Mostly, certain kinds of media types compared to other countries' media types. Fax machine always is a great example. but at the end of the day, the proliferation of digital things often engenders just more stuff to think about. So PowerPoint's if you think about that cartoon I showed about the two kind of men arguing, and which kind of encapsulates the generational divide. If you look a little bit more closely, the way that is framed is that the old generation is about literally drafting documents, and one of the reasons Korean companies have these rules about spacing and margins has to do with drafting, and that in 70s and 80s people were literally drafting reports by hand. And people may imagine now that they're just thinking about contents and not form, but people spend a massive amount of time on form, right? So I spent a lot of time when I was working doing a survey at Songdo, doing colors of charts, um, gradients, space, how to like lay out this kind of information, how to like block quote people. And so in some ways, looking at any kind of medium that you're in, I mean, we have this huge proliferation of things to now mediate our social relations again. So in some ways I can sympathize with people that want to get rid of PowerPoint and just go to one-page stuff, which then isn't really about digital at all. It's about something else. And so just to maybe think about the question, oftentimes that where digital can often seem to be about efficiency, people then often later have to think about the nature of mediation and all these new media forms that come along with it. So yeah, digitalization can be a good way to do national comparisons, but at the end of the day, it's these different this explosion of office technologies has really changed the landscape, and certainly not made a short workday for anyone around the world.
Okay, we have a question coming in. So I'm gonna read the one question, then we'll see whether Professor Junan is there to ask question directly. So this question is from France. PhD student at Sorbonne University in Communication Department. So it's from Paris. You have a worldwide followers, Mike. So here is the question. I'm quite curious about the semiotic aspects regarding the various documents you collected during your working time and field work within a Korean company. As you mentioned, documents can be very interesting source to tackle the way we form knowledge. And the question said, the example of the one-page report was fascinating. Now, here's a question. Did you get into other semiotic aspects of these documents report or other work mediation maybe?
It's a great question, and yeah, certainly a lot of people in France have been doing this stuff, like Latour and Beatrice Frankel, I know, and some of their stuff there's not a lot of conversation, probably with people in shared interest in the US. Maybe I'm in UK and I can bridge it, but I'm very interested in, semiotics of documents. It gets very obscure to some degree. Looking at the different sort of aspects, you can think of a document as a text, but any Korean document is usually filled with other kinds of peripheral stuff, like about confidentiality, about approval. I mean, Koreans often will stamp a document when it gets approved. I've attempted at some point to think about the semiotics of PowerPoint, but it's like so crazy kind of rabbit hole to jump down to think about all the visual and sonic and motion aspects that go into PowerPoint. So in some sense, I was a little too afraid to do that that kind of thing. But it's certainly certainly something I wish more people did and understood, because in part because it is those semiotic aspects, not just in terms of their, the visual alignment or visual symbols, but the relationship between how people understand a certain kind of visual form or textual form, and then what it does, in a social context, is important to understand and think about, and how people understand that in relation to the institution itself. I mean, things like law offices or courts or governments are a little, they have somewhat more stable forms, and businesses are really just tricky to study because they have so many forms. They're copying from all over the place. Koreans that I worked with were copying and modifying templates from like British Airways and US human resources things. And so there's in some ways as a kind of a project to systematically look at it, it was just way too difficult, and I never ended up going fully down that path. But yeah, if in the future, I certainly would love to. And I'm trying to move next into interfaces, mobile phones, how people log into app interfaces, messaging apps, that kind of thing. So that may allow me to do it in a sort of more smaller screen and without all the politics of corporate life. But yeah, I mean, it's still there, and I think it's a big issue to think about.
Okay, great, thank you.
Great question.
I think we have Professor Junan online. June, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me? If there are other questions, you could have gone to those first, but because mine's a really silly one, and it's so typical of me to throw you this curveball, Mike. But
I can't fix your PowerPoint for you.
My question sort of comes with a little bit of, I think, silly context. I've been watching 놀면 뭐하니? I don't know if you've actually watched any of the recent episodes, but there's a really weird new kind of skit that Yu Jae-suk and some other folks are doing on that show. And what they've done is they've basically invented it's not really fake, but it's a production company, right? And they're producing their own female kind of girl group with older female singers. And the thing that caught my attention was, if you look at the way they kind of sort of sardonically make fun of corporate culture with this kind of made up production company, it deliberately challenges a lot of the kind of outdated norms that are probably still actually in use in our big corporations in Korea, right? So what that signaled to me was that already in kind of popular consciousness, there is a yearning for an alternative corporate, I guess, communication style. And they really sort of point at this almost every single week, that they need to change the way employees communicate with the CEO and how and so on anyway. So my question is a really general one. So how does your research on this subject, right? Where does it go from here? And how does it fit into the more recent developments taking place in Korea right now? Because I think it's a little different from when Korea was really at the height of its kind of worshiping of corporate culture. So.
Well, yeah, thanks for bringing up the TV thing. I'll bring it up. Sometimes the shows can be a little too traumatic to relive, like Misang or something, because they remind you of all the worst parts. So it'd be good to see something that's a little bit more lively, and taking the fun out of it. So, but that was sort of a curveball at the end. So the question is, if how to think about, where to situate this in perhaps Korea or Korean studies. I mean, I do think, if you look at, the history of writing about corporations, it was in Korea, sort of the tale of the 80s and 90s, and thinking about mass structural changes, people moving into offices, the development of the chaebol, development economy and that kind of thing. And I don't think, there's been a kind of big narrative, at least in the field or in any of the social sciences, about how to think about corporate labor, other than through the neoliberalism discussions, which were really hot in the early 2000s. Something I've wrestled with as well. Obviously, you don't want to reproduce or just battle with, this isn't developmentalism again. And there are aspects to the, neoliberalization that are still ongoing. But in some ways, the reference point for a lot of the neoliberal change was in 1997, which is already 23 years ago. And so it's in some ways it's hard to think about what that narrative is or what it should be. And I think probably in Japanese studies there's the same issue around how to talk about white collar life and in today. where the narrative is always about the 90s. So for me, the way I try to do it in my book manuscript is to, think about how, these kind of how office workers think about advanced forms of media or new forms of, media to try to kind of perfect, a sort of the corporation or the office life as kind of an ideal social system. There's a lot of this idea, going back to the TV show perhaps, is around kind of constantly tweaking things and constantly engaging in forms of communication or documentation that sort of can allow the communication to align with the corporation, but then sort of that corporate image to align with some sort of ideal, kind of secular Korean life. And there's this sort of constant battle around tweaking dimensions of office life and which parts to tweak and which not to tweak, as almost kind of a perfectionism thing. That's how I've started to frame it, and that sort of gets away from the developmentalism and away from the only focusing on the neoliberalization, which is still very important and having different kinds of effects. But for my research, it's this, I don't want to say social engineering, but kind of media engineering, and thinking about the corporation as kind of a new way to witness Korean society is something that I've been thinking about, and something of way to frame it. So hope that is sort of getting at what you're getting at.
Great. So we have about 3 to 4 minutes. So there are several questions, but I want to apologize to Do-hee and Yeonju that I will not get to your questions. But I'm going to end with one final question, and Mike, we have about a couple of minutes to answer the question. This is an interesting question from a freshman at Michigan. I don't know whether you have read or watched Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, 1982년생 Kim Ji-young.
Yeah, read it. Yeah.
I recently watched the movie, and in that movie, there's a clear tension between women and men, white-collar workers, and even different speeds at which workers get promoted depending on gender. Was that gender factor visible in some way in your research?
Yeah, many ways. I mean, there's too many to talk about in some ways. In this thing, reporting and PowerPoints, luckily that seems to touch every gender, and a lot of the people that I got really good insights on about PowerPoint and how to think about it were from female coworkers. Maybe I could just talk about the Kim Ji-young, and I've read a lot about it, and people have been writing really good stuff on it. A sociologist colleague of mine at Wisconsin has written on this, I believe it's called Motherhood Ideology, and I think that really gets at the heart of some of the tensions in Kim Ji-young, which is that there's this idea that no matter how competent or successful women are in college and even early in their career, there's a certain assumption that people will eventually become a mother, and that's in sort of a social trajectory that you need to go into. And I was just teaching something by Choi Jung the other day, and she talks about housewifeization, which is a good phrase to describe that kind of gender equality, and you do still see that in obviously in Korean companies, and where there's an assumption that people will work and then leave. And the sociology work that's come out, I think, has shown that women who do choose to stay in corporate life have to make a massive amount of adjustments in their personal life, in their especially in terms of caretaking and getting their mother's support or mother-in-law support, and what's a sort of a natural course for men is a really big shift that women have to find on their own in terms of getting social support to continue working in corporate labor, or else be in a kind of difficult situation of perhaps not getting married or not having children, and then getting judged on the other side for not fulfilling this kind of cultural standard of being a mother. So yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff on it. Yeah. That's all I can say, and it's a really good issue, and yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Great. Thank you, Mike. It's great. Thank you all who are here to listen and asking questions. This is a wonderful homecoming event for Mike.
Yeah. I mean, I can stay on. It's I don't know if we have that sort of figurative after the lecture kind of hangout, but
But we will have Mike's email available, or you can, I don't know whether you have a Facebook or follow him and ask questions. But I want to thank you, everyone, for being a part of this wonderful time this afternoon. And one thing that I want to remind you is that we have a next colloquium talk by the Susan Hwang. She's a faculty member at the Indiana University. Topic is South Korean song movement in the 1980s. It will be November 17th at 4:30. So hopefully I will see all of you at the next colloquium lecture. Thank you, Mike, again. Thank you, everyone, for attending this talk. Okay, bye.